My name is Ellen Marshall. I'm 41, single, and the founder of a materials recovery company based in Pittsburgh. People outside my world call it green tech, but in my family, it's still known as that thing I do with trash. I rent the top floor of a brick building once owned by a glassworks company, a space that smells faintly of solvent and coffee, and overlooks the gray veins of train tracks cutting through the industrial quarter. I live above the operation, not for convenience, but for control. My work begins when the city stirs and often ends long after it sleeps. At gatherings, when relatives introduce themselves with titles and firm names, I am the one who gets described with a shrug. The older sister who never quite got it together. The one who chose scavenging over stability. My parents still send me job postings for positions I'm overqualified for. My younger sister, Victoria, once called what I do noble, the way one might describe a volunteer who cleans bird oil spills. It's late November now, the kind of cold that makes steel moan and glass brittle. I'm packing for the annual Thanksgiving trip to Harrisburg, a journey I make with equal parts habit and hesitation. Every year, I bring modest gifts, avoid sensitive topics, and play the part assigned to me. I've learned to smile with restraint and disappear without notice. But this year feels different. The air has a sharpness to it, a kind of prelude. I can't explain why, but I know I won't return from this trip unchanged. Something will shift. Something already has. I saw it in the subject line of an email this morning, a brief sentence that now pulses behind my eyes. I haven't opened it yet. Maybe I won't. Or maybe I already know exactly what it says. It started with copper wiring and a gut feeling. I remember the first time I truly understood what other people had overlooked. It was a rainy Thursday at an estate sale in Erie. Most of the crowd had cleared out before noon. The good pieces already claimed by antique dealers with better contacts and deeper pockets. But I stayed, walking through the dim hallways of a house emptied of life, down to a basement that smelled of mildew and old carpet. Leaning behind a collapsed bookshelf was a tangled spool of wiring, labeled as scrap. Something about the weight of it in my hand, the texture of its braiding, told me it was more than debris. I bought it along with a box of discarded electrical components for $50 and drove home in silence. A week later, I sold the wiring to a small manufacturer in Michigan for over $7,000. That sale didn't change my life, but it changed my posture. After that, I started documenting everything. Circuit patterns, board materials, discoloration patterns from aged plastics. I tracked origin codes. I taught myself the difference between high-grade tantalum and cheap substitutes just by touch. I attended auctions in towns most investors wouldn't bother to map. I talked to plant managers on their lunch breaks and shipping clerks who let things slip when no one was listening. For years, Greenline was just me and a few part-time contractors. We operated out of a converted warehouse with leaking skylights and unreliable heat. I stored high-value components in locked tool chests beneath false shelving. I taught myself QuickBooks at night, logged inventory by hand, signed every invoice personally. There were no rounds of seed funding, no sleek pitch decks, no announcements. Just strategy, silence, and small wins that added up. The first major deal came from a bulk purchase of decommissioned hardware from a telecom company going through rebranding. I found a memo buried in a regulatory filing. Routine to most, revelatory to me. I knew what they were planning to phase out. I called, made my pitch, and offered to take everything off their hands for next to nothing. They accepted. 3 weeks later, after sorting, grading, and a careful breakdown, I extracted enough rare metals to make a deal with a supplier in Austria that doubled my capital overnight. I never told anyone. Not because I was hiding, because no one asked. My family still thought I was sorting trash in a warehouse, playing business while real adults handled clients in courts. I let them think that. In the economy of our household, Victoria had always been the currency. Her awards, her articles, her polished Christmas newsletters with professional photography. I was the one who still brought home homemade bread and packages wrapped in craft paper. The discrepancy wasn't just in income, it was in perception. Over time, I became deliberate. I built Greenline behind a firewall of LLCs and non-disclosure clauses. I operated under contract with private equity firms under the radar. I used pseudonyms in certain transactions, trusted only a handful of advisors, and filtered every new hire through layers of vetting. I reinvested most profits into real estate with long-term value. Never flashy, always stable. Warehouses in Indianapolis, storage yards near ports, old government buildings up for auction. There was something satisfying in the invisibility. To walk into a negotiation and watch someone underestimate me, to see the shift in their expression when they realized I understood every clause, every margin, every game they thought they were playing alone. I wasn't trying to hide success. I was protecting it from misinterpretation. There was a contract I signed in year 6 that still stays with me. A defense subcontractor was offloading outdated inventory due to a compliance reclassification. Most buyers dismissed the lot as too risky, unverified, unlisted, potentially untraceable. I spent 2 nights reading export control documents and compliance exceptions. On the 3rd night, I found a loophole. On the 4th, I made a call. I bought the lot, cleaned it through a third-party vendor, and resold it piecemeal over 18 months. Total profit, just under $2 million. There were others. A shipping container mislabeled in Baltimore. A lot of obsolete monitors with casings that turned out to be fire-retardant polymer worth more than the screens themselves. A crate of salvaged laboratory equipment from a university in Vermont that contained a series of temperature-stable alloys I sold in Tokyo for 12 times what I paid. Each win came quietly. No champagne, no announcements. I told myself it was just strategy, but part of it became habit. The silence hardened into identity. I learned to move without the need for applause, to separate self from performance, to hold the value of things in my own hands without waiting for someone else to affirm it. And yet, beneath the structure I'd built, there was a fault line. Not in the business, in the narrative. No one in my family knew, not even vaguely. They still asked me twice a year if I'd considered getting certified to teach. My mother forwarded me job postings for school administration. My father sent me clippings about waste management reforms in local government. I answered politely. I thanked them. I never corrected the assumptions. The truth felt too large to insert casually, too out of sync with the roles we'd assigned each other long ago. I wasn't ready to watch their surprise calcify into something worse: ownership, expectation, or that particular kind of suspicion that appears when people realize you've done well outside their definition of effort. And so, I preserved the distance. I wore old boots to family dinners. I brought thoughtful but inexpensive gifts. I helped peel vegetables, smiled through stories about Victoria's firm landing another high-profile client, and answered questions about my project with carefully curated vagueness. Until last Thanksgiving. Until one line of text, black letters on a glowing screen, unlocked everything I had kept closed for a decade. Until the room shifted, and they stopped seeing me as the sister who hadn't figured things out, and started wondering what else I had kept from them. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a low, colorless sky and the faint smell of frozen leaves breaking under tires. I had woken early, not out of excitement or anticipation, but from the kind of alert stillness that tends to follow a long period of internal rehearsal. My hands moved efficiently through a list I had already memorized. Wrapped the cranberry oat bread in parchment and twine. Packed the 2 books I had chosen for my niece and nephew, one on climate systems, the other a visual history of urban infrastructure, and make sure the car's rear tires were properly inflated. The drive to Harrisburg took longer than usual. Traffic was heavy with families migrating toward warmth and obligation. I kept the radio low and my thoughts quieter. The passenger seat held the gifts and a small tote bag with my phone tucked into an inside pocket, screen turned down. My parents' house looked unchanged from every year prior. White shutters, trimmed hedges, flagstone paths swept clear. Victoria's black SUV was already in the driveway, parked at a slight angle, as if to remind the world it arrived with purpose. I parked on the street without irritation. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of sage and starch. I stepped into the role I knew well, hands full, smile even, voice low. My mother greeted me with orchestrated brightness. My father emerged from the den holding a glass of something amber. Victoria's voice carried from the kitchen, punctuated by phrases about client deliverables and capital leverage. Everything was familiar. That was the point. I placed the bread on the sideboard, removed my coat, and folded it over the banister. My gifts were set near the entry table. No one noticed them. I moved into the kitchen and took my place near the cutting board, waiting for tasks to be assigned. There were vegetables to chop, water to boil, dishes to rearrange. Victoria recounted a story about a former classmate's IPO. My mother half listened while organizing serving spoons. The dynamic unfolded exactly as expected. When my father entered, he remarked on Victoria's latest article in the Regional Legal Review, then asked me in the same breath if I was still keeping things going at the warehouse. I replied with something measured. No one asked for more. The hours passed this way, quietly absorbed in the well-worn grooves of our family machinery. When my niece and nephew arrived with their father, they offered polite hellos, then retreated to their tablets. The books I had wrapped sat unopened on the piano bench. My brother-in-law asked about parking permits in Pittsburgh and whether the waste disposal fees had increased. I gave short answers. He didn't seem to notice. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen reached that precise moment of compression when every burner is occupied and everyone's patience begins to stretch. My mother moved between the stove and the sink, issuing low instructions. Victoria checked her phone periodically, sighing each time it buzzed. She mentioned something about waiting on an important email. I was straining cranberries through cheesecloth when she asked if she could use my phone. Hers was nearly dead, and the reply couldn't wait. It was not a dramatic moment. That came later. At the time, it felt routine. I nodded without thinking. The phone had been resting on the counter near the fruit bowl, face down. She picked it up. I kept working. There were still onions to dice and herbs to trim. A full minute passed before I noticed the silence. Not the absence of voices, but a stillness, like the room had stopped exhaling. I looked up and saw her eyes locked on the screen. Her thumb hovered. She wasn't scrolling, just reading. No one else had caught on yet. My mother continued basting the turkey. My father was stirring gravy and humming under his breath. The children had gone upstairs. The screen glowed softly in her hand. She didn't look at me when she placed the phone back on the counter. Nothing was said, not immediately, but the tone shifted. My mother asked why the oven timer hadn't gone off. My father suddenly decided the dining room table needed to be reset. My brother-in-law began offering opinions on white wine temperatures. Victoria stayed quiet. She moved a bit more slowly, eyes slightly unfocused. I noticed her checking her phone again, though it had already died. Her posture had changed, barely, but I registered it. Shoulders tighter, jaw set. Something had shifted in her, or perhaps something had finally revealed itself. I retrieved my phone and glanced at the screen. The notification still sat at the top. A message from my financial advisor congratulating me on a successful quarter, referencing the company valuation and the property acquisition slated for early next year. Nothing dramatic. No exclamation marks. Just numbers, dates, and calm precision. I slid the phone into my pocket. No one asked to borrow it again. The table was set. The food was plated. My mother lit the centerpiece candles like she always did. 1 match, 3 wicks, no fuss. Everyone took their seats. For the first time, no one asked me to lead the blessing. The meal began as it always did, with small talk and practiced cheer. But there was an undercurrent now, something brittle just beneath the surface. My sister kept glancing at me with the kind of expression one uses when trying to solve a problem without the full equation. My father was unusually quiet. My mother refilled wine glasses too often. I ate without urgency, tasted without commenting. I knew what they had seen. I knew they hadn't processed it yet. That would come later, in the form of questions that would sound like accusations and assumptions that would sound like concern. But for now, I waited. Not because I was afraid, because this time, I wanted them to be the ones who had to ask. The turkey sat half-carved on its platter, a decorative sprig of rosemary clinging to the edge of the cutting board. Plates had grown cold. Candles burned low. Someone had turned off the music without anyone noticing. The room carried the odd stillness that follows an impact, the kind of silence where no one knows whether to resume what they were doing or brace for the aftershock. My sister was the one who broke the pattern, though not with movement. Her chair shifted slightly against the hardwood floor, the sound too sharp in the quiet. Her phone had died completely now, and mine was no longer in reach. She kept glancing at the spot where it had rested, as though it might offer more if she stared hard enough. Her fork remained poised, untouched, over her plate. My father's wine glass was half full, his eyes darting between my sister and me in a rhythm that suggested calculation more than confusion. My mother was still eating, or pretending to. Her gestures were precise, deliberate. She was trying to keep the table from fracturing. The first question came with a smile, measured, tight, far too late to be casual. I responded briefly. A confirmation, not an elaboration. The silence that followed hung in the air like fog over water. Reactions came in waves. My father asked again, more pointed this time, as if the initial answer had been misheard. My sister sat straighter, voice sharper now, tone sliding from curiosity to control. She wanted data. She wanted details. She wanted language she understood, percentages, timelines, legal structures. I answered selectively, leaving the parts she wanted most unsaid. The children had been excused by then, ushered upstairs with tablets and vague instructions. My brother-in-law removed himself from the table, pacing the living room with a glass in his hand and a phone in the other. He began typing rapidly. No one asked what. My mother still said nothing. Her knife scraped across porcelain, the sound echoing strangely. She was no longer pretending to eat. No one raised their voice, not at first. But volume has many forms: emphasis, repetition, the narrowing of language until it becomes less a question than a demand. They began to piece it together, or try to. Numbers appeared, dates, mentions of property and transactions. Someone remembered a time I had declined a family vacation. Another recalled a birthday gift that now seemed too modest. Retrospective judgment settled in. What had once been dismissed as frugality was being reframed as deception. What had once seemed like smallness now registered as strategy. Each recollection fed the next. They constructed a new version of me, backwards, starting from the number they had glimpsed and working in reverse, reassigning meaning to years they had not bothered to ask about. Eventually, the questions shifted form. No longer how but why. No longer curiosity but resentment. Assumptions followed, swift and uninvited. Someone suggested trust funds. Someone else floated stock options. There were references to children's futures, tuition fees, family needs. The conversation became less about discovery than justification. Still, I said very little. I observed the shifting posture. The way my father leaned forward now, no longer in disbelief, but in proposition. The way my sister began to frame sentences with we, drawing invisible lines of inclusion that had not existed 10 minutes prior. They were beginning to reorient. Not around me, but around what they had seen on the screen. They were no longer reacting to my presence. They were recalibrating around a new asset. My brother-in-law returned to the table, this time with suggestions. Investment vehicles. Real estate partnerships. A possible expansion plan through his practice's network. He had not asked what I wanted, only what I was willing to contribute. My mother finally spoke, tone soft but weighted. She mentioned sacrifice, family bonds, mutual care. Her phrasing was elegant, practiced. She spoke of support as an inheritance, not a transaction, of giving as a duty, not a choice. I kept my hands folded. What had begun as confusion had hardened into something more angular. There were glances that held accusation, tones that dripped with implication. I was no longer the sister with a small company. I was the one who hadn't needed help, but had never offered it. The logic was circular but persistent. I noticed the way my sister's voice changed when she referenced her children. It became more deliberate, more performative. She mentioned potential, opportunity, sacrifice. There were tears, not uncontrolled, but placed carefully within the rhythm of her sentences. She spoke of needs and futures and how one person's silence could burden many. I did not correct her. It wasn't the moment for argument or explanation. The house grew smaller with each passing minute, the air denser. Someone opened a window slightly. Someone else lit another candle, as though scent could drown tension. By the time dessert was served, no one touched it. My father cut slices out of habit, and my mother set out plates that remained untouched. The room felt exhausted, not from food, but from the effort of reassembling itself around a truth it had not invited. The roles had shifted. They had not been reassigned, only exposed. The hierarchy thought they understood had been disrupted, not by force, but by fact. And that was the part they struggled with most. I didn't need to say I was right. I didn't need to point out the years they had overlooked, the choices they had dismissed, the work they had never asked about. It was all there, in their sudden urgency, their recalibrated tones, their efforts to reposition themselves in proximity to something they had once ignored. I sat still. The room moved around me, voices rising, logic bending, alliances shifting, and I remained where I was, unchanged, except in their eyes. Winter receded slowly that year, as if reluctant to let go. The streets of Pittsburgh remained crusted in salt through March, and the river edge held the memory of frost long after the snow had disappeared from rooftops. I spent most mornings alone in the office above the warehouse, reorganizing files I already knew by heart. There was no rush to begin anything new. Some things needed to settle before they could be moved forward. Green Line continued its rhythm, untouched by the disruption of Thanksgiving. Contracts were honored, shipments arranged, audits passed without incident. I responded to inquiries with the same clarity as always. No doors closed, a few opened. In early January, a former client from Minnesota reached out unexpectedly. He had heard about the valuation not from me, but through a supplier's quarterly report that had mentioned Green Line in passing. His tone was more careful than before. He asked whether I would consider consulting for a project his company was piloting in Arizona, focused on closed-loop material recovery in the aerospace sector. I said I would think about it. 2 weeks later, a curator from a regional museum visited the warehouse. She had heard from a mutual acquaintance at an environmental summit and wanted to tour the facility. Her questions were deliberate, observant. She asked not just what we extracted, but why we chose the partners we did. At the end of the visit, she left behind a brochure for a lecture series titled Industrial Heritage, Future Tense. My name was penciled into the March slot, though we hadn't agreed to anything. I didn't object. The first public recognition came in February through a modest write-up in an independent journal on sustainable industry. The article focused on small enterprises disrupting conventional recovery systems through quiet innovation. It mentioned Green Line only briefly, but the context was accurate, the language restrained. It felt like being named without being exposed. There were other acknowledgments, more subtle. A message from a former professor who had once questioned the viability of private sector environmental work. An invitation to speak on a panel at a local university, a handwritten note from a retired engineer in Iowa who had read the journal article and included a newspaper clipping about rare earth recovery. These gestures arrived like folded letters slipped beneath the door, not declarations, but recognitions. Inside the company, not much changed. We hired a part-time archivist to organize legacy transaction records, a decision that had more to do with structure than expansion. I continued overseeing operations personally, still wary of too much scale, too fast. I was careful not to change the pace that had served me well. Outside, however, the air was different. People lingered longer after meetings. Offers became more collaborative. The tone in conversations shifted from instruction to inquiry. I noticed the difference not in what was said, but in what was no longer omitted. Questions came with context now. Suggestions came with curiosity. Even my landlords, who had once treated my lease with the detachment reserved for industrial tenants, requested a walkthrough to better understand how the space supports growth. Their language was vague, but their intentions were transparent. I agreed to the tour, kept the conversation polite, made no commitments. 2 weeks later, they offered first refusal on the adjacent property. In March, I accepted the museum's invitation. The room was modest, the audience mixed, students, researchers, a few industry consultants with notebooks. I spoke briefly about the technical side of what we did. I kept the language plain, focused on material flows and life cycle analysis. I avoided anecdotes. Still, at the end, there were more questions than time allowed. One student stayed behind to ask whether I had always known this was the path I'd take. I told her that some structures are built slowly, without blueprints until they're solid enough to stand. She nodded as if she understood. At home, things remained quiet. My parents called more often, though rarely with substance. Their messages arrived as updates about local news, requests for recommendations, seasonal greetings. There was no mention of Thanksgiving, no mention of Victoria. Only the soft presence of something unfinished, like a conversation that had been left mid-sentence. I responded intermittently, briefly, with care. The most unexpected contact came in April, an email from a design institute in Portland. They were developing a curriculum around sustainable design and wanted to license part of our internal training material as a case study. They offered compensation, though modest, and suggested co-crediting if I agreed to participate in a mentorship track. I declined the latter, but approved the licensing. A few weeks later, they sent a copy of the draft syllabus. Greenline was listed between two multinational brands. The formatting was clean. My name was spelled correctly. I printed the page and filed it, not out of pride, but for the record. By May, the city had begun to bloom again. Trees flushed green in bursts, sidewalks cleared. The buzz of construction returned with a familiar rhythm. I took longer walks through the industrial quarter, tracing routes past lots I had once considered bidding on. I revisited some. Others I let go. There was no celebration, no clear line that marked before and after, just the quiet return of balance, the sense of weight shifting without fanfare. I still kept the same office, the same boots, the same schedule. But sometimes now, when I walked through the warehouse, someone new would pause and ask a question. Not out of suspicion, but because they wanted to learn. And I answered, not because I needed to explain, but because it no longer cost me anything to be seen. In the silence after they walked away, I returned to my work. Nothing had changed, and everything had. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope, hand-addressed in dark ink. Inside, a simple card. My name, the title of the event, and a date in early October. It was the annual Summit on Sustainable Innovation, hosted by the Institute for Industrial Renewal, a gathering of practitioners, policymakers, and researchers who rarely overlapped in practice, but often spoke the same language when it came to materials, systems, and impact. I had attended once years ago as an anonymous audience member seated in the back row. This time, the card included the word keynote. I read it twice before setting it on my desk. The months leading up to the summit unfolded with quiet steadiness. Greenline moved into its 9th year. The team had grown modestly. One new operations manager, a data analyst, and a logistics coordinator who had once interned with a competitor, and now spoke of our facility as a rare example of working principles. We completed 2 large contracts in the summer and began an exploratory partnership with a European firm developing modular recovery systems for remote deployment. Internally, we had implemented a new tracking system that offered more granular insight into material yields. It had been my idea, though I credited the team when the results came in. I'd grown used to stepping back from recognition. It no longer felt like withholding, just balance. When October arrived, I flew to the summit alone, bringing no prepared slides, only a small notebook and the worn leather briefcase I had carried since Greenline's first deal. The event was held in a renovated train station. Iron beams, reclaimed oak flooring, light filtered through restored clerestory windows. A subtle nod to the past repurposed with intention. My session came on the second day. The audience was polite, expectant, but not reverent. They were there for insight, not spectacle. I spoke not of profit or growth, but of systems, how materials move when no one is watching, how value hides in overlooked processes, how time itself can be a form of leverage if one is patient enough. I mentioned our early failures and the choices that shaped our practices. I did not speak of family, not directly. Still, in the Q&A, someone asked what had surprised me most in the journey. I answered simply, that silence, when maintained long enough, can be mistaken for absence, but also for strength. Afterward, a small group stayed behind to ask further questions. One woman introduced herself as a teacher from a vocational high school in Ohio. She had brought 2 students who were interested in alternative supply chains. They asked for a photo. I stood beside them, not smiling broadly, just enough to show I was present. That evening, back in the hotel, I read through a short article someone had forwarded. It had appeared in a quarterly publication on leadership and legacy. The article referenced understated builders, those who worked not for recognition, but for function, for structure, for purpose. Greenline was mentioned near the end, without flourish. Just a line, evidence that long-term vision can be measured not by volume, but by clarity. I folded the page and placed it inside my notebook. In November, nearly a year to the day after that Thanksgiving, I received a message from the director of a foundation that supported women-led industrial enterprises. They were creating a mentorship cohort and had been referred to me by two separate organizations. Would I be willing to join as a mentor? The time commitment was minimal, they said, but the impact would be significant. I accepted. The following week, I returned to my alma mater, invited by the engineering department to speak to final year students about applied systems thinking. The lecture hall was smaller than I remembered. The chalkboards had been replaced with touchscreens. At the end of the session, a student asked whether I had ever doubted my path. I said that doubt was part of the work, not a deviation from it. Afterward, a professor I hadn't seen in over a decade handed me a note. It was a short thank you, handwritten on department stationery, ending with the sentence, "We should have seen what you were building." I kept the note, not as proof, as perspective. There were still days I returned to the office before sunrise, still shipments to track, still calculations to verify. But something in me had settled, no longer waiting for acknowledgement, no longer guarding the truth of what I had created. There was space now for reflection and for something softer than defense, recognition without demand, presence without performance. The world had not tilted in my favor. It had simply stopped resisting what had always been there. And in that stillness, I understood something I had only glimpsed before. That vindication, when it arrives quietly, allows you to carry it without needing to raise it like a flag. It sits beside you like a companion, not a weapon. Sometimes, justice doesn't sound like thunder. It just sounds like your own footsteps, finally moving forward without interruption. Sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that take the longest to be heard. Not every journey is paved with recognition. Some are walked in silence, through years of being underestimated, through rooms where your voice wasn't invited, through dinners where your name was only mentioned in passing. But even in that silence, something is being built. Something solid. Something real. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you're still there. What happens when the narrative others assign you no longer fits? When the version of you they accepted is too small to contain who you've become? Do you shrink to stay familiar, or do you let the silence break? I've learned that validation doesn't always arrive in applause. Sometimes it comes in the form of a handwritten note, a quiet nod across a room, a student asking a thoughtful question, a moment of being seen, truly seen for what you've built, not for how loudly you built it. So if you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told your path made no sense, maybe this story was meant to find you. And if you're building something quietly right now, I wonder, who are you becoming while no one is watching? And when the moment comes, because it will, how will you choose to step into the light? Let that question linger. And when you're ready, share what you've carried. Someone out there might be waiting for your silence to break.